Hi, I'm Swenson-Ruble from Quilty Zest, and today we're going to talk about binding. Binding is the finishing touch on your quilt, that outer edge that protects the layers of your quilt top, your batting, and your quilt backing, and also adds a little decorative touch to it. And so today we're going to learn how to put a binding on a quilt. So we're going to be using 2¼ inch wide strips for our binding. If binding is a new technique for you, you can also use 2½ inch wide strips, which gives you a little more leeway as you're adding the binding to the quilt. The first step for binding is to cut your strips. And to figure out how many strips you need to cut, you want to measure the outside perimeter of your project, all 4 sides, and then add 12 inches to that measurement. And that will give you the total length of binding that you need. And then you'll divide that number by 40 because a width of fabric is approximately 40 inches, and that will tell you how many strips you need. We also have a handy binding calculator guide on our blog, so make sure to check that out. After you cut your strips, you're going to trim the selvages off of the end, and then we're going to join them together using a diagonal seam. So you're going to lay your first strip right side up and your second strip right side down and align the raw edges of these 2 ends on a 90-degree angle like this. You're going to take a ruler and a marking pen or pencil and draw from that corner down to this corner. Now what I like to do is to use the 45-degree line on my ruler to help make sure that I have that line straight. So I've got a line here, and now I'm going to stitch on this, and then after I open it, I will have my strips joined together with a diagonal seam. So do that for as many strips as you need to bind your project. Our next step is to press the binding strip. First, we're going to press any seam allowances open, and this eliminates bulk when you add the binding to your project. And then we're going to press the entire length, wrong sides together, like this, so that it's doubled up. So match your raw edges and just keep working the iron along the length of your binding so your strip is folded in half. So now that our binding is made, we're going to add it to the quilt. I'll be binding this zigzag mini quilt that I made using one of the free patterns that comes when you purchase a fat quarter bundle. And what we're going to do is lay the quilt down, and we're going to just put the binding on top so we can make sure that our seam does not end up in one of the corners where there will be a little more bulk. So I like to start on one side and just loosely lay it out around. Okay, and there we go. And right now my seam is over here. And so it's not anywhere near a corner, so I'm good to go. So I'm going to start out by, I want to leave about a 6 to 8 inch tail right here. And I'm going to start sewing right here, and I'm going to match the raw edges of my binding to the raw edge of the front of the quilt. And I'm going to stitch down to within 1/4 inch of this corner, and I'm going to stop at that 1/4 inch point and show you how to do a corner. So I've stitched along my first edge, leaving that 6 to 8 inch tail, and then I've stopped stitching 1/4 inch from my corner point. And what I'm going to do to create this mitered corner is to flip the binding up so that the raw edge of my binding aligns with the next raw edge of the quilt. I've got what looks to be roughly a 45-degree fold right here. And then I'm going to press on that to crease it, And then I'm going to fold that same binding strip down so that my fold lines up with this raw edge, and I cover up that folded part. And I'm going to press that too. Now at this point you can put a pin in here, or you can just pinch it with your fingers and take it over to the sewing machine. And you're going to sew all the way down this edge, stopping 1/4 inch from your next corner. So I've stitched down this edge, and you can see I start right at that top edge. And if I kind of pinch this open, you can see this is where my miter will be when I flip the binding around to the back. So I've got this entire edge stitched, and I'm going to do the same thing on this next corner. And I'll show you again because it's always nice to see it more than once. So I'm going to fold the binding up so that my raw edge of my binding aligns with the raw edge of my quilt, and then just finger press that crease. And then I'm going to fold the binding strip down over that finger pressed crease. Finger press again so this fold is lined up with those raw edges, and then stitch all the way down the edge of my quilt. And I'm going to do that on all 4 sides. And then when I get to that 4th side, I'm going to stop, leaving about an 8-inch opening between the 2 ends of my binding. So don't stitch all the way, leave this much open from stitching, and then we'll talk about joining those bound ends. Now it's time to join the ends of our binding. So we've got an opening here, around 6 or 8 inches, and we've got 2 long ends of binding. What we're going to do is trim one of these ends, and I like to have about 4 inches here of unstitched binding to work with because we're going to need to manipulate these. So I'm going to trim that nice and square, and then what we're going to do with the second end is fold it back so that these almost but not quite touch. And I do it that way because I find I sometimes end up with a little extra binding, and then I end up with a pucker. So by having them not quite touch, I eliminate that issue. And then I'm going to take a ruler, set it down next to this. Now because my strips are 2 1/4 inches, I'm going to cut a piece that is 2 1/4 inches long. So you're going to make sure you're only going through this top folded layer, not that layer. And keep your line your fold up with the edge of the ruler, and then cut at 2 1/4 inches, just like that. So now we've got our 2 ends to join. So now we're going to join these 2 binding ends the same way that we joined the binding strips in the beginning. So we're going to lay this strip, and then what I usually do is fold the quilt over like this so that the quilt's not pulling on these strips. So I'm going to lay that strip and then put the other end on top, making sure the raw edges match. And because we're working with a tight strip length here, what I'm going to do is put in several pins. So I put one, and I'm going to draw the line in a minute. I'm just going to put the pins in first. So I put one above where the line's going to be, and I put one below it. And then just for added security, I put a 3rd pin in along that bottom edge of that bottom strip. And so now I'm going to take my ruler and my pencil and draw that line. And yes, my pins are there too, but I can see where my line is going to go. And I'm going to stitch along this line, and that will join those 2 binding strips. So I stitched on my line, and then the one thing I'm going to do before I trim that seam allowance is just open it up and lay it flat and make sure that it's the right length and that I have everything going in the right direction. Because once you cut those triangles off, you have a lot less flexibility to fix a mistake. So I'm going to trim off. And this gets, so honestly, sometimes I just do this with the scissors because trying to get your ruler to lay flat with the quilt top underneath it. So I'll just trim it off to a 1/4 inch seam allowance with my scissors. and then I'm going to finger press that open so that there's no added bulk. And then I'm just going to continue sewing and add and to stitch down this last little bit of the binding strip. Now that my binding is completely joined, I'm going to press it open. And this just makes it easier to get a crisper fold as we move it to the back side. And in the corner, just gonna press that little miter out. And we'll deal with that on the back side, but I'm just pressing all the way around my quilt, which goes pretty quick since mine is a mini quilt. Okay, and now I'm going to flip my quilt over to the back side. Now this is when it's handy to have some of these binding clips because I'm going to secure the binding in place. And so what I'm going to do is fold, this is the folded edge of my binding, and I'm going to fold it over, make sure it covers this stitch line, which is where I added my binding on, and I'm going to press. And so I'll generally do about an iron's length, and then I will come through and put these binding clips on. Now, I put the binding clips with the flat side on the back like this, because then the curved side is on the front. And this just helps to hold your binding in place as you stitch it, either on your machine or by hand. So then I'm going to work down a little bit more. And sometimes you'll need to tug a little bit on that binding to get it stretched over your stitch line. And that's okay. And just keep working your way around. Trim off any threads if you need to. And keep pinning in place. If you don't have binding clips, you can do this with regular pins as well, but the binding clips are just great. And once your binding is pinned in place all the way around your quilt, it's going to be time to secure your binding down. And you can do that one of two ways. You can hand stitch on the back and do a blind stitch so that you're attaching the binding just to the backing fabric. You don't want to go all the way through, but if you just stitch by hand all the way around the edge of the quilt, you'll secure that binding edge in place. The other technique you can use is you can stitch it on your machine. And what you're going to want to do is make sure you use a coordinating thread, and you're going to stitch so that your needle falls right in the ditch here between your binding and the edge of your quilt. And you may need to move the foot on your machine over slightly to do that. If you have a foot for your sewing machine that looks like this, it's got a little, almost like a rudder on the bottom. You can use that, and that will guide along the edge of your binding and kind of push it out of the way for the stitch to go in. So this is a really helpful foot to have. This foot is called a blind hem foot. And then as you stitch on the front, it will go through the binding on the back and secure it in place. Now, if you're new to this technique, I recommend starting out with 2.5 inch wide strips instead of 2 1/4, because it gives you a little more wiggle room on the back to make sure that you catch the binding all the way around. But you're going to just stitch down to the corner, pivot, and continue all the way around until your entire binding is stitched in place, and then your quilt is done. And that's how you add a binding to your quilt. If you found this YouTube video helpful, make sure to check out Sit and Sew's other YouTube videos showing how to do different quilting techniques.